Good morning, everyone. Please do come in, take a seat, come towards the front. Delighted to announce the first session of day 2 of VARC. We have a panel on mental health and the psychology of sustainable advocacy, which will be chaired by the CEO of the Vegan Society, Libby Pepiat. There'll be a little bit of time for questions at the end after a presentation by Libby, and then there'll be a panel with scope for some questions. Please do use the Hoover app, go to the event, and then Q&A, and then ask questions and upvote questions, and that's how we'll manage that. But without further ado, please welcome to the stage Libby Pepiat.
Good morning, everyone. Did anyone go to karaoke last night and still recovering? I couldn't possibly do that. I'm very impressed if anybody went. So I'm Libby, and I'm the Chief Executive of the Vegan Society. I've been in post for around 10 months now. Professionally, I'm quite new to the movement. But before coming into role, I spent around 20 years working in restorative justice and mental health in the main. And I did some really exciting things. I designed and delivered anti-stigma campaigns that challenged the discrimination that those of us with a lived experience of mental health problems often face still. And I was also privileged enough to run some mental health recovery services in Oxfordshire that were very person-centred. I'm not a clinician, but I spent many years working alongside clinicians, researchers, people with lived experience, and campaigners. And there was one key question that sort of started to keep me awake at night in this work, particularly in the context of how we support people who, through the course of delivering services, were listening to quite traumatic histories and testimony and histories of abuse. And that question was, what does it take to stay well in work that's emotionally demanding, that feels morally urgent, and often feels relentless? And that's why this topic really matters to me. So I'm going to state something quite obvious now, but it's something that perhaps we don't allow ourselves to recognize often enough. Everybody in this room has chosen a path that's not easy. We've chosen a path that asks us to see what the vast majority of people avoid, willingly ignore, or pretend just isn't happening. And we live our values in a world that often actively resists them. And being vegan or being an advocate and activist for animals isn't just ethically demanding. It's emotionally demanding, it's psychologically demanding, and it's quite literally neurologically demanding. So today, alongside a really esteemed panel, I'd like to explore a slight reframing of that question that I posed myself when I was working in mental health, and one that I think is really tailored to our movement. And that is, how do we stay emotionally engaged, emotionally alive even, and in this work for the long haul, without burning out, without hardening, or disappearing from the movement entirely? And we're going to start looking at that through 3 key lenses. The first is the psychological cost of caring. The second is looking at what stress and trauma actually do to our nervous systems. And the last is something that I call the activist rhythm. It's not anything about music or dancing, unfortunately. It's not a new concept, but it's a way of putting a frame around thinking about this work in the context of weaving in care for ourselves and for others as an integral part of it. So to the psychological cost of caring. If this work hurts, it's not because you're weak, it's because your empathy is working and is still intact. Psychologist Clare Mann uses the term dystopia to describe the anguish of being vegan in a non-vegan world. And she talks really eloquently about the chronic sense of moral dissonance that we feel, living in a culture that normalizes what we feel absolutely ethically unbearable. And for many advocates and for activists, that experience is layered with 2 other really well-established psychological realities. The first is moral injury, the distress that we feel when we repeatedly witness or we are forced to coexist with violations of our deepest values. And the second is vicarious trauma, where the distress that arises for others, something that we repeatedly witness, we feel even though it's not happening directly to us. So if you regularly are exposed to footage and images of animal suffering, if you work in investigations, if you're campaigning, work in outreach or education, and if you have conversations again and again that minimize the harm that you feel is so obvious, or as we all do, you carry that constant sense of this should not be happening to animals, then your system effectively is in a chronic moral and emotional load. And that shows up in very, very human ways. Anger, grief, exhaustion, sometimes cynicism, sometimes we feel a bit numb, or that quiet, corrosive feeling that I'm never quite doing enough. But there's a reframe that really matters here. These are not personal failures. These are predictable, normal human responses to prolonged moral stress. So we're going to make this a little bit more biological and practical now. So Dr. Dan Siegel talks about something called the window of tolerance. And it's the zone where any one of us can think clearly, we can feel our feelings without being overwhelmed by them, we can stay connected, and we can respond rather than react. And everybody's window is different. We are all a kind of rich tapestry of all of our individual experiences, and everybody's window looks a little bit different. But when we're inside that window, we can be both passionate and strategic. We can feel anger, justifiable anger, but we can channel that anger really effectively and constructively. We can hold nuance, empathy, and long-term thinking. But when we're outside that window, we enter survival mode. And survival shows up in patterns that I'm sure are really familiar with all of us here. And there are a number of responses. So if we are in fight response, we can feel that we're arguing all the time, we're burning ourselves out in constant conflict. If we enter kind of flight mode, we can start to feel quite avoidant. We can feel that we disengage, we would just want to disappear. If we freeze, we can feel that sense of paralysis or hopelessness. What's the point? Or if we fawn, we can enter kind of people-pleasing mode. We can make ourselves smaller and talk less about our values to please people who simply don't agree with them. So when you're outside of your window of tolerance, what's really important to recognize is that you don't lose your values, you just lose access to your best thinking, to empathy perhaps sometimes, and to your strategic thinking. And the hard truth for probably all of us here is that just existing in this world can feel like we are chronically outside of that window of tolerance. So if you feel reactive, exhausted, or shut down a lot of the time, that's not because you're bad at activism or advocacy. It's because your nervous system is trying to survive in a morally overwhelming environment. But there is a bit of hope here, quite a lot of hope, and I'm going to come to that in a moment. And a reframing that I think is really helpful is to understand that our brains are evolutionarily wired to prioritize threat and to hold on to the negative. Negative experiences stick, they imprint, and they replay. And neuroscientist Rick Hanson puts it in a way that I really like. He talks about the brain being Velcro for negative experiences and effectively being Teflon for positive ones. So if we think about what that means in our context, if you're regularly exposed to images of cruelty, suffering, hostile conversations, political setbacks, and online conflict, those experiences don't just pass through you, they stick. Meanwhile, a small campaign win, a meaningful conversation, you see somebody's values nudge, shift, or a moment of connection, those things can literally slide off, just like Teflon, unless we consciously make an effort to let them register. So over time, what can happen is that our internal landscape can become disproportionately weighted to holding on to or being alert to threat. And that's not because the good doesn't exist, it's because we are hardwired to do that. So we need to intentionally rebalance, because if we don't, we can end up trying to do long-term moral work with a nervous system that's absolutely saturated in threat. And this is the hopeful bit. So this is a really, really simple framework. It's basically blending a lot of concepts developed by people far smarter than I. But I call it the activist rhythm. And the push is the work itself. It's the challenging of injustice. It's the campaigning, the protesting, the educating, the influencing, and the investigating. And the refuel is the regulation. It's the rest. And rest, by the way, means very different things to different people. It's not just about dining tools and not doing anything. Rest can mean just doing some really vigorous exercise. People rest in different ways. It can mean finding meaning, connection, establishing boundaries, recognizing beauty, and allowing yourself to feel safe. And the return is coming back to that work after refueling with steadiness, with your compassion intact, and being ready to keep working for the animals. Now, most of us are very, very good at push, and many of us feel deeply, deeply conflicted about refuel because the suffering is always real and urgent. There's always more to do, and guilt, unfortunately, tells us that rest and looking after ourselves is an indulgence. And to be honest, movement culture often quietly rewards exhaustion, rewards just keeping pushing on. So we often end up in patterns like this. Push, 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 and collapse. Or push, numb, disappear from the movement. But while discomfort is part of change, recovery is absolutely integral to sustainability. Or even more simply, if there is no refueling, there is no long-term gain. There's a really simple analogy that I used to use when I worked in mental health. If you were friends with a firefighter and they told you, your friend told you that, 4, 5, 6 days a week, they went to the gym, they did strength training, they did a bit of cardio, because they absolutely were convinced that this helped them be the best at their job, the best at their vocation. I don't think there's anybody in the room who would tell that person, how dare you waste your time doing that? There's always a fire somewhere. Why aren't you picking up more shifts? Why are you wasting time at the gym? But when we think about our own mental health and our well-being, we can do that to ourselves. And we can avoid seeing this work as a vital component of showing up for animals and instead see it as an add-on or an indulgence when it absolutely is an integral part of being able to continue to show up. Caring for yourself is not stepping away from the animals, it's ensuring that you're there for the long term. Micro tools. We've created a refuel toolkit to go with this session, and we're going to give you a QR code so that you can link directly to that, and it's full of short, realistic practices that take minutes, not hours. And I'm going to walk through a few examples of that, but I also want to make clear that this is a kind of short toolkit, and we're going to build on it and build it out over time. So if you find anything that's useful in that toolkit right now, do revisit in a few weeks' time, in a few months' time, because we're going to keep building that resource and keep adding new things to it. And I also want to make clear that these exercises aren't about fixing things. We know we cannot fix things completely, but they're about mitigating, helping us to reset our nervous systems and stabilize. One of my favorites are grounding exercises. And what I love about grounding exercises is that you can use them as a kind of pre or post intervention. So if you're expecting to have a challenging conversation, or you know that you're going to look at some material that's going to be deeply upsetting, you can do a grounding exercise. Or if you're the other side of that experience, and you've had to look at really distressing material or have a really difficult conversation, you can do a grounding exercise. And one of the most simple ones that I really like is the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 grounding exercise. It literally takes moments. And all you do is you gently name to yourself 5 things that you can see, 4 things that you can feel physically, 3 things that you can hear, 2 things that you can smell, and 1 thing that you can either taste, or if you can't taste anything, 1 thing that you appreciate. And all this very simple exercise does is it anchors your brain back to the present. It interrupts a spiral or a worry, and it signals to your body that you're safe. Another really nice suite of exercises are breathing exercises. So I think most of us will be familiar with that feeling that if we could feel quite anxious about something, our breath can kind of quicken, and we can start feeling that we're shallow breathing, and our kind of heart rate increases as well. A bit like when you're just about to get up and talk to a room full of people, that feeling can start. But what we can do is we can deliberately slow down our breathing, particularly by elongating our exhale. And that allows us to do something quite interesting. It allows us to activate our parasympathetic nervous system and signals to the body that you are in a place of calm. So you can try this with me, or you can just kind of watch. There's no forced interaction, don't need audience participation. But just a simple exercise of breathing in for 4, and breathing out for 6, you just do that for 60 seconds or a little bit longer, you can find that you sort of enter a slightly calmer state. It has a clear effect on the nervous system. And again, this isn't about becoming or forcing yourself to try and become calm in a world that absolutely isn't calm. It's about giving your nervous system just enough steadiness to be able to choose your response rather than feeling that you're always reacting to what's happening to you. There are lots of other really simple ways to help your nervous system reset in the moment. Cold water is one of the quickest. It's not just a dramatic thing. When you see people splashing cold water on their face, it actually really does work. It activates something called the body's diving reflex, which actually slows down your heart rate and nudges you again towards that calmer parasympathetic state. And I like to think of it as almost like a little bit of a kind of biological pause button. And you can also hold something cold to your cheeks. It has the same effect. And there's also other things you can do, like sort of just standing and feeling your feet very solidly connecting to the ground, or holding your hands together, or even just sort of squeezing your arms. All of these things can help signal to your body that you are contained, that you're safe, especially if things start to feel a little bit overwhelming, or sometimes I describe them as feeling a little bit floaty when things feel very intense. And the thread through all of these sort of micro tools and exercises is that they work with the body, not just the mind, because when we feel really overwhelmed, sometimes we just don't have the tools to think our way out of that feeling. So it's connecting the body with the mind that can really help. I think just prior to moving onto our panel, which is the really exciting part of this session as far as I'm concerned, I think it's really important to say something about what happens to us when we're repeatedly exposed to distressing material. So a psychotherapist called Maureen Freed, who I've done quite a lot of work with, and I would absolutely advocate anybody looks into her writing. She's done a lot of work with social researchers who are exposed to a lot of kind of traumatic histories and materials in the course of their work. And she talks about exposure to distressing material as a bit like radiation. Each exposure is like a fresh dose. The impact doesn't really lessen just because you've seen the same things before, you're aware of what's going on, and it's another story that you're really familiar with. And rather than building tolerance, continued exposure can actually be cumulative, especially if it's not processed. And I think that's probably something that everybody in this room is more than familiar with. It's not necessarily easy just because it's easier, just because it's the 10th time that we've heard a familiar story. So part of what we're doing with these tools is helping that stress move through the body rather than get stuck in it. Because when it doesn't move, it accumulates. And when it accumulates, we tend to see one of two patterns. Sometimes we become more sensitized. Everything feels louder, heavier, and unsustainable. And sometimes we become desensitized. And let's be honest, sometimes that can feel slightly comfortable, not to feel quite as much. But if we do become numb, what happens in the medium to longer term is that starts affecting everything else. So it does connection, it does those feelings of joy, and how we can recognize meaning as well. So again, this isn't about fixing anything, it's about noticing what's happening in our system and giving a small but important opportunity to our body to process and release through breath, through movement, through grounding, so that it doesn't just stay stored. Because what we don't process, we carry. And this is also where Rick Hanson's idea that the brain is Velcro for bad experiences and Teflon for the good becomes kind of part of our responsibility, really. And we can reframe refueling as not an indulgence, not something that's nice to have, but an integral part of the work. And that might mean allowing yourself to do things like stay with a moment of connection for 20 seconds or more. Let a small win really land and celebrate it. Allow yourself to spend time with animals where they are flourishing, not just focusing on suffering, and allowing yourself to celebrate and be in that moment. And giving yourself permission to pause long enough for your nervous system to encode that you are safe through the exercises that work for you. So explore all of those tools and techniques. Not everything works for everybody, but you'll find what works for you and what clicks. And again, this is not denial of the reality that we are working to change. It's finding balance within it. Because resilience isn't built by ignoring pain. It's built by not letting pain being the only thing that your nervous system stores. So we're just going to take a moment now. We've named the cost, we've looked at what's happening in our nervous systems, and we've also looked at, hopefully, a really nice simple reframing in a way that we can kind of build rhythm, build refueling into how we work rather than collapse. But all of this theory only takes us so far. What really matters is how this shows up in lived experience. So now we're going to move into exploring the psychology in this work through people who've navigated it at the sharpest edges. And so if you give us just a couple minutes whilst our panel assemble, I'm absolutely honoured to be joined by Clare Mann, founder and director of Animal Justice Project, who's had years of undercover investigations and high-impact campaigning. David Magner, who is a former slaughterhouse inspector turned incredible vegan activist, who brings a rare and really vital perspective to this work. And Stephen Balfour, who's an author and a thinker on veganism and mental health, exploring how we stay well and make meaning in this work. Thanks so much, everybody. Come on. Come on. Okay, balancing the nervous system. Okay. Yeah. Oh, I forget I've got a mic so close to me. Okay. So I've got a few pre-prepared questions, but hopefully we'll have time to take some questions from the floor as well. So my first question is for David and Clare together, actually. So I'm really interested in exploring how long-term exposure to systemic harm can both shape a person in challenging ways and strengthening ways. And also, what do people outside that experience perhaps underestimate about the work?
Well, thank you. Hopefully all you can hear me. Pretty nervous to be up here, but I want to thank Libby for bringing me on. That firefighter analogy was really incredible. And thank you to all you legends for being out there doing all the work that you're doing. It's inspiring. For me, I often talk about the times I go to the slaughterhouses because I often go to vigils. It's something called Project Livestream that we go and we witness the animals going into their final moments. And I think one thing that really sticks with me often is that the animals, they still look to you as if you're still doing something in their best interests. And meanwhile, they're about to go through that moment. But in that moment, I think what it does is it sharpens your resolve. I think it empowers you. I think it gives you a voice to be able to bring to others, like say when you're doing street outreach or talking to family, because you're seeing them in the eyes. And it's something that kind of sticks with me, and it really emboldens me to become more active, I think.
Hello, can you hear me? I just found your talk really interesting, and I think certainly, I don't know whether this is properly answering your question, but I think certainly the numbness is something that, when you sort of see footage over and over, I mean, some of you who went to my talk yesterday, I started Animal Justice Project in 2019, and I think, the amount of sort of slaughterhouse footage that I've seen is a lot. And you do see the same footage over and over and over. And I guess I've kind of been thinking it sort of does get better over time, but I think certainly I do numb off. And I think that's why, this is really important. And I'm just really grateful that you're kind of doing this work. But I think also, as David said, I think it really does strengthen strengthen your resolve and kind of strengthen your values when you do see that kind of footage over and over. But I think the cumulative effect is really interesting, because I think, certainly for Animal Justice Project, it helps that we really focus on our wins and our successes, and even things like writing summaries at the end of the year and writing reports to donors. It kind of really helps to sort of focus on the good really and the good that it's done. But I think it is really interesting the fact that we are seeing more and more footage, and how we can deal with that is an interesting one.
Thanks both. I'm going to turn to Stephen now. What patterns do you see in long-term activists?
And yet, hopefully everybody can hear me, and you don't need subtitles for my Scottish accent. But burnout obviously has been talked about a lot in the last couple of days, so that's a very common thing that somebody will come and see me and look to get some help with. This kind of numbing effect, I suppose, would be compassion fatigue, which is slightly different. Again, I've got a lot of people coming to see me who are a bit concerned about they're just not experiencing, that the worry with that is sometimes you're not experiencing good things in life as well. It's just a general flattening of emotions. Sadly, trauma, PTSD, you don't just have to be on the front line. If you're watching lots and lots of footage, obviously you can get vicarious trauma from that. There's issues as well, obviously, because we're wrestling with so many emotional difficulties that can lead to conflict, both internally about previous behaviour and actions that you've engaged in, being a non-vegan, and also in your engagement with the family members, friends, etc., etc. And then just a few other things. I suppose we're lucky we're all here together, but I do see a lot of people are quite isolated. That's quite a common kind of theme. Guilt, shame, and the other couple of things, I think as we become more involved in this as a movement, we start to extend that to other issues as well, which is a good thing, and it's a good thing to do, but that can just be an added element of complexity and challenge, and sadly the final thing would be, depression is something I'll see a lot of people coming to me, just a kind of feeling of being overwhelmed and being helpless and hopeless. Yeah.
Thanks, Stephen. You touched a little bit on guilt there, which leads nicely into the next question, which is firstly for David. How do you distinguish sort of healthy moral urgency from a guilt that can sort of feel quite corrosive?
Yeah, I like everything you said there, Stephen, just kind of hit home for me personally. There's a lot of time where I spent a lot of time alone, isolated, feeling guilty, ashamed. Obviously for working where I did, but also the fact that I can't change everything immediately. I think one of the best things that I ever did was realize that I had a problem, that I had to reach out and not. I think I grew up in an era where I like this macho kind of era where you had to like take care of everything yourself. I was hesitant for therapy, but ultimately I did look into therapy, and it helped me extensively. And I can't underestimate it enough. And I think everybody should really go to therapy. I remember speaking with my therapist, and it really helped me, because you can live in your ego, you can live in shame, you can live in this idea of like just being down in the moment consistently, but that is your ego, and you can reframe things. And what my therapist said to me was, you don't have to bear the weight of what's happened in the past anymore. She said you can live for today and share your story, and then that can be your therapy moving forward. And then forward, you can fight, for the animals. So
it's a really lovely example, actually, David, of being in the present, and it also leads really neatly onto the next question, which is for Stephen. From a psychological perspective, how do responsibility and shame differ? Because they are two different things, but I think they can get quite conflated, can't they?
Well, I think David's almost answered the question, which is good. I suppose if we look at responsibility or accountability, the kind of focus on that is about your behaviour rather than you as a person. So you think about being vegan, you might think about in the past eating animals, so you're thinking about the behaviour rather than your identity. The goal then is to repair and change. So that might be going vegan, and it might be convincing other people to go vegan. The net result of that in terms of the nervous system is it allows you to regulate that, allows for reflection, learning. Social result of that is it does encourage empathy and relationship repair, and the kind of orientation or direction that takes it in is it's forward facing. So it's quite a healthy process to go through, and if you think about it, when I think about it, there's a bit of movement there, isn't there? Whereas if you contrast that with shame, which is never a good thing in any shape or form, rather than looking at the behaviour, you actually look at it as being you're inherently flawed. There's something wrong with you. That results in a lot of self-punishment. This leads to dysregulation. It does trigger the survival mode. People often withdraw, can become defensive, aggressive, and it tends to be past-facing as well, so people become stuck and you ruminate, so it's just not a good place to be, and I think David kind of summed it up in reverse. Just far better to recognise you've been involved with something you don't feel good with, but try and make a positive contribution going forward than just beating yourself up, which serves no purpose whatsoever. So, yeah.
Thank you. Claire, the next question for you, I think you've already partly answered, but you might want to elaborate it a little bit more because you talked really eloquently about how you very intentionally celebrate the wins. So the question is really around how you prevent guilt becoming the fuel, and I think you've already partly answered that, but if there's anything else that you want to...
Yeah, I mean, I think all of us feel guilty. I mean, you know, I've lost countless nights' sleep because of guilt, because, you know, certainly working on the work that Animal Justice Project does, I mean, when you imagine, you know, how much footage that we have, and then we have to kind of narrow that down to a snapshot, and that's painful, you know, because there's so much footage that nobody will ever see, but you've had to bear on your own. So I think, you know, making it sustainable, basically like not letting sort of guilt lead your actions. I think guilt is kind of something you feel, and it's like, it kind of creates kind of a short-term feeling and short-term actions, but I think, it's really kind of, trying to be sustainable and like, you know, working to strategies as well. So we find that, you know, working to a strategy, even though you're kind of seeing this kind of urgent situation and you feel guilty about it, but I think knowing that it's part of a long-term strategy, understanding your campaign, knowing that you're going to be taking action in the long term, and I think, just basically working to strategies helps, but also taking time to appreciate those wins as well, I think is really important, because I think certainly at AJP, I feel like sort of in recent years, we've had so many wins and so many successes, but it's almost like you kind of gloss over them. So I think it's really important to take time to really celebrate and give yourself a pat on the back and just appreciate the small differences that you are making.
Thanks, Claire. I mean, we've only got 5 minutes left, so I just want to kind of move quickly to sustainability, and this is a question for everybody, and kind of touch on it a little bit already, but how do you sustain compassion and clarity over time? We've talked about the importance of strategy, reflecting on the wins, being in the moment, not sort of always sort of looking back, but looking forward. What protects that steadiness for each of you?
Yeah, I think you touched on it, and also you as well, the processing of things, also the small victories. I remember it was a few years ago, I had an event going on, and all of a sudden I was getting phone calls of people not showing up, and I just felt really low. And I thought, oh my gosh, like, what am I doing? Like, am I making a difference? And I had someone tap my shoulder and ask me if I remember if I had a conversation a few years prior with some lady, some stewardess. And I'm like, yeah, I do actually remember that conversation. It was a whole day. We had a really powerful conversation. I remember like a tear came down her eye and it froze because it was so cold out. I was just 3 activists out there, and she just wanted to let me know that it really changed her life, our conversation. And I just, that cold November night when no one was showing up to my event, you know, that just was like the touch I needed, the inspiration I needed to keep going forward. Like, wow, you know, I'm actually making a difference. And I know sometimes we're not going to hear it, but every little action makes such a huge difference, and I learned from that moment. So,
Thanks, David. Stephen,
Yeah,
Claire?
I was just going to say, probably just remember to focus on connection, because that's really good for your well-being. And probably the key word would be positive connections, and every now and again, just take stock, because, you know, I think back to probably many years ago, being involved in quite a number of toxic vegan kind of online groups and spend a lot of time, and there's a lot of infighting, and it doesn't do your health and well-being any good. It certainly wasn't serving any justice. So I think, yeah, try and develop a bit of a support network, and connections doesn't have to just be with people. Spending time out in nature, with animals, etc., can be really good for nourishing your soul, I suppose. And so, yeah, that's what just add self-compassion as well for yourself, I think. If you think about the number of times you speak to yourself and give yourself feedback compared to how much external feedback you get, obviously it blows that out the water. So if you find yourself being really overly critical of yourself, just try and catch that and work on that. And there's tools you can use to catch that. So, yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, and just to add, yeah, Stephen, I think you mentioned it, but I think spending time with animals, I don't think you can overestimate how important that is. You know, if you're working on, for example, against pig farming, and you can go to sanctuaries and see animals, it sounds obvious, but honestly, just like a day, an open day, as well as supporting the sanctuaries, just, it can really, really help your mental health and just pull you back to remember, you know, why you're doing what you're doing.
Thanks, everyone. I think we run out of time, unfortunately. Yeah, thanks for that kind of really open and honest conversation. And where there might be some questions in the room, so what I would say is that we're all kind of around for the rest of today. Please do come up and have a conversation with us if you, yeah, sorry we didn't get a chance to kind of fill more questions. But yeah, thank you so much, panel, and thanks so much for showing up today.